Okay, thank you all for coming. Thank everybody on YouTube. So we're continuing on the Sutra, the 26th, chapter 26, turning the wheel of Dharma. And we have just been reading last week about how the Buddha came and was invited to teach, requested to teach by the gods and so on, and he declared himself worthy of that. And and now that he's about to invite his five disciples, his five friends who had traveled with him before to the caves um, for their meditations as the ascetics, and now they've all met with him at Sarnath in east of west, excuse me, west of Sarnath, west of Varanasi. So what we've done last week was to have someone read this recitation. So if let me see. So I got a list of people who read last time. So Bernie, could you read first, please? Would you mind
Starting,
reading
starting where?
26.59?
59, you say, 59?
That's right, 59. So if you'll read the next few pages until the end of 26.80.
Okay, until the end of 26.80. Okay,
Yeah, and then we'll have a discussion after that reading, and then we'll continue on with another recitation.
okay. Starting now. Monks, the
Oh,
thus
before we
one,
start,
yes.
Yes.
I just wanted to, I shared a link to a Dharma talk that I gave on the seven factors of awakening in 2022. Like so it was a long time ago, but I still had it written out. So I just shared that in the chat if anybody was interested in reading that. It talks about the seven factors of awakening based on this writing that was done about it by a Thervadian monk. So it's a little different. It's this insights from a different perspective than we would normally see through the Tibetan perspective. So just wanted to share that. Thank you.
You said you put it in the chat?
Yeah, I just stuck it in a link in the chat. So
What
you can
chat?
just,
Our chat here?
yeah,
I don't see it.
it's said to everyone.
In the Buddha Practice study group, I don't see it. There's something about the AI thing, which,
It's right under that.
well, let me look
Uh,
again.
Yes, I do see it. I see it
I
says
can share it again.
Oh, wait a
709.
minute. Okay, I got to move the bar down. Sorry.
Yeah, so it's just a link to the Google Doc. So people, if they're interested, they could read it.
All right, well, very good. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, yes. And I didn't ask, does anybody have any comments or questions that you'd like to raise before we begin the recitation tonight? Okay, then Bernie, when you're ready, please.
Okay, and I end at 2680, right?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Okay, monks, the thus gone one now spent the final part of the night in silence. During the middle part of the night, he gave an eloquent talk. Finally, during the last part of the night, he summoned the five excellent companions and said, monks, there are two extremes that you should avoid when you have taken ordination. First, do not follow self-indulgence, which is shallow, worldly, ordinary, unworthy of a noble one, and attended by undesired consequences. In the long run, it will prevent you from practicing your religion. You will become distracted and unable to develop non-attachment. You will not enter into the state of cessation, nor develop higher knowledge or attain the perfect awakening of nirvana. On the other hand, straying from the middle way, you will not pass beyond suffering. If you mistreat your body so that it suffers and is harmed, you will face difficulties as can be observed right now, and in the future, even further misery will fall on you. Monks, the thus gone one teaches the Dharma by showing the middle way that does not fall into either of the two extremes. The Dharma that he teaches is one of correct view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. Monks, there are also four truths of the Noble Ones. What are these four? Suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. What is suffering? It is the pain that accompanies birth, growing old, falling sick, and dying. It also includes the suffering of meeting the unpleasant and parting from the pleasant. Not finding what is sought is also suffering. In short, the five perpetuating aggregates are suffering. This is what we call suffering. What is the origin of suffering? It is the craving that perpetuates existence, which is attended upon by the passion for enjoyment and which finds pleasures here and there. That is the origin of suffering. What is the cessation of suffering? It is a complete and dispassionate cessation of craving that perpetuates existence, which is attended upon by the passion for enjoyment, which finds pleasures here and there. This is the cessation of suffering. What is the path that leads to the cessation of suffering? It is exclusively the Eightfold Path of the Noble Ones. This is the path that starts with correct view and ends with correct concentration. It is called the path that leads to the cessation of suffering, a noble truth. Monks, these four truths are the truths of the Noble Ones. Monks, this teaching I had not heard previously. I understood it by intensely and introspectively focusing my mind on suffering. In this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, this teaching I had not heard previously. I understood it by focusing intently on the origin of suffering. In this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, this teaching I had not heard previously. I understood it by focusing intently on the cessation of suffering. In this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, this teaching I had not heard of previously. I understood it by focusing intently on the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. In this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, within this teaching, I had not within this teaching that I had not heard previously, suffering must be known. This I understood by focusing intently on suffering. In this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, within the teaching that I had not heard previously, the origin of suffering must be abandoned. Thus, I understood by focusing intently on the origin of suffering. In this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, within this teaching that I had not heard previously, the cessation of suffering must be actualized. This I understood by focusing intently on the cessation of suffering. In this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, within this teaching that I had not heard previously, the path that leads to the cessation of suffering must be practiced. Thus, I understood by focusing intently on the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. In this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, within this teaching I had not heard previously, I have fully understood suffering. This I did by focusing intently on suffering. In this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, within this teaching that I had not heard previously, I abandoned the origin of suffering. This I did by focusing intently on the origin of suffering. In this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, within this teaching that I had not heard previously, I have actualized the cessation of suffering. This I did by focusing intently on the cessation of suffering. In this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, within this teaching that I had not heard previously, I have practiced the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. Thus, by focusing intently on the path that leads to the cessation of suffering, in this way, my wisdom, vision, understanding, intellect, intelligence, knowledge, and insight became manifest. Monks, in this way, I generally contemplated each of the four truths of the noble ones, which I recited them 3 times, while I recited them 3 times. Still, I did not develop the wisdom that sees their 12 aspects. Monks, therefore, I did not make any claims of having awakened to unsurpassable, perfect, and complete Buddhahood, and I still lack the insight of wisdom. However, monks, once I had recited the 4 truths of the noble ones 3 times, I developed the wisdom that sees their 12 aspects. At that point, my mind was free, and my insight was now free and pure. Monks, at that point, I declared that I had awakened to the unsurpassable, perfect, complete Buddhahood. My wisdom, vision had been developed. My births had been exhausted. I had carried out my religious practice. I had done what needed to be done, and I will not have another life.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So if anybody has any question that these teachings did not originate from Buddha Shakyamuni, the thus gone one, the victorious one, here in the sutra we see that this is the ground on which the Buddha Dharma rests. So here he's saying, this had never come to me any other way. This was not taught to me. I did not read this anywhere. These were things that I discovered on my own through my own meditations, through my own practice, through my own use of logic and thoughtfulness and so on. So seeing my way through all this. So this is an admonition to us all that this is the path that the Buddha followed and is a noble path for each one of us to follow if we, wish to attain that level of awakenness. Does anybody have any comments or questions right now? Okay. Well, then let's go through this, and because this is so powerful, I think this is awesome. Here, I've been studying for over 20 years, and here it's really being laid out. I hear you hear references about this, but here is the source. Here is the way that it has come to us, and so on, and that's priceless. To have the confidence that these sutras, mean so much, and that everything else, all the other practices, everything rests on these sutras. So it's very, very powerful. So the first admonition is in 26.60, where he's talking about self-indulgence. So how would you characterize that? Zara, what do you think about that? How would you characterize self-indulgence?
Well, said 2660.
Yes, 2660.
Got it. Well, so self-indulgence for me, and this is also me tying in some of the self-study, Lance, that I've been doing and looking at Hinduism and some of the scriptures that have led into this. I would say it fundamentally is going to go back to sensory distractions from your five main sense organs and being able to have to at will turn those off and on to recognize um, that, like, have enough self-awareness of that. So you talk about self-indulgence, I think about very practical translation of what that means. It means succumbing to your personal sensory desires, either at excess or under excess for your five main sense organs, and then your six being, if you want to categorize thoughts, like letting your thoughts run amok without getting them. The way you would control your palate, you got to control your thoughts. So self-indulging unhealthy thoughts, unhealthy eating habits, physical movement, touch, all this. That's what I think about when I read that. So that you have to be able to have training of your physical vessel before you can start training the stuff inside. So that's what I think about from practical. I don't know if anyone else has ideas, but that's how I read it.
Okay. What do you think about self-indulgence of wisdom?
So you mean like pride?
Pride, ego?
Sure.
I mean, would that be included in what you're talking about?
Yeah. So I'm thinking, so like initially self-indulgence as a broad category. I think of the physical vessel, like you can overeat, oversleep, but then I think you move from the physicality, and then you start going on a continuum, right? From like the physical vessel, and then like the mind or intellect, right? Things that are less concrete and a little bit more abstract. So that yes, because then we get into the eight worldly concerns, right? Why am I doing this behavior? Um, I'm indulging because I want more gain, social praise, or avoiding loss. So yes, I think people could use that. I don't know how many people would have heard of the eight worldly concerns. Um, I'm assuming everyone would at this point, but like anyone on YouTube, right? So that's what you mean, right, Lance? Like leading into that, like as you transcend the physical vessel, then you have time to use your brain to get more attention and praise and stuff. That's what you mean?
Well, yeah, the word self, what that implies. You're speaking about the physical aspect of it and so on, which is certainly, pertinent and so on, but there's also that intellectual side, the prideful side, as you just said, and so on. And I think that, that self-indulgence into that, thinking, oh, I've got it all sussed out. I don't need this. I'm quite satisfied with who I am now, and so I choose to ignore, that there's a possibility that there's more to, or I have created more than needs to be created. That I'm missing the essence of what it is to be a human being, what it is to be in this world, and so on.
Well, I think most people, like if you're looking at that particular specific verse, self-indulgence, if we read that sentence, two extremes void when you have to do not. So he's talking in reference to people who've taken ordination. So first, do not follow self-indulgence. Um, so yes, I think it's like also recognizing self-will versus you're in service, selfless service to others, right? Like I think there's a huge distinction at a conceptual level when you're looking at that. Like what I need, yeah, I have to go to the bathroom, I have to eat food, I need to walk my body, I need to sleep sometime. Like those are basic things to maintain, but the vessel and what we're in ultimately should be in service to others and reducing suffering of others, right? So if you're in any way, like you can overread a book, right? You can over consume knowledge to where it's not useful anymore. Like people just read stuff like, why are you reading that? Why are you putting more stuff in your head? You may not need it. So I think about that as a broader concept. What do you think about what I just said? Like, so understanding the distinction between selfless service, like meaning you've given your life and literally helping to reduce the suffering of others to where you're not going to overconsume an extra meal. You'd rather give it to a homeless person, as an example. Does that kind of go in the direction of what you're asking? Like that
Yeah,
would,
I think it's inclusive of all those things. Anything that revolves around the idea of a self, being existent and being the center of all endeavors and so on. So,
Lance, and I think most people, and I don't like, I'm reading the reference, the first sentence, take an ordination, and I don't know what that actually mean for like a layperson is every day when I get up and I do the prayers for the Bodhisattva, like taking the action bodhicitta and taking the Bodhisattva vow like every morning when I do that as I meditate. I'm guessing that would be some lay version of that, but like meaning to be mindful of that idea. But um, do you feel like when you're reading this and interpreting this, that it was written from a long view of lay people would be consuming this, or this would just be written for monks to consume, like from a knowledge base?
well, I think it is for all beings, to
Yeah.
answer your question, but I think in particular that these five beings that he's invited now to come and listen to him, that these are to be the first ordained members of the monastery, member of what he's creating in terms of of an institution, if you will, of to be able to practice. They're being ordained, they're being blessed, that and they're accepting the ordination to continue in this way, to begin to learn how to renounce their worldly lives for the benefit of other beings. He hasn't gotten to that yet, but that's, he's establishing, that there is this movement towards away from the self, away from self-indulgence into the idea of working for others.
And I mean, obviously you're wanting to focus on that verse, but like as you progress developmentally through the rest of the verses, like the cure is the Eightfold Path, right? Like the as you and but that's later on in verses, subsequent verses, but that kind of gets to, I'm sure you're going to drive that point home, like the medicine or the cure. But you have to have that concept and understanding, like that's the source of it. This is the way to get it out of the body or the mind and the vessel. So thank you for asking the question.
Thank you.
If I could just say one thing. You ask what's the lay equivalent to monastic ordination? That would be taking the five precepts would be the lay equivalent of that.
Bernie, do you mean so like I just want to make sure because sometimes I Google stuff and I get slightly confused. So is that like not like engaging in like drinking alcohol, like that sort of stuff?
Stealing, lying, sexual misconduct, and use of intoxicants. That's the five precepts that lay people take. And that would be the equivalent to monastic ordination for lay people.
Okay. Okay, that's helpful. That sounds like the cards that Lance has sent us with the 10 virtues and the 10 non-virtues. They're on that card.
They're related, but they're taking precepts as a formal ceremony that one goes through, where one makes a commitment to not
To violate.
violate them for the rest of your life. So
Have you all done that, Lance and Bernie? And I guess I know Kunga has, but
Certainly.
how do
yes,
is it a formal ceremony? Do you go somewhere for the just how does that happen?
Well,
it,
go ahead, Bernie.
it is a ceremony. It's typically sometimes it's given along with refuge, sometimes it's given as a separate ceremony. So yeah, within at least within Tibetan Buddhism, it's a separate. It's a ceremony, sure, where you are in front of the teacher and you make the promise to keep the five precepts. Actually, you don't need to take them for the rest of your life. It's possible to take them for a certain period of time if that's what you want to do. So, or even to take a subset of the five precepts, but normally people take the 5 precepts altogether.
Is it extremely ceremonial and prescribed, like where there's prayers, there's incense? Is it's very formal?
It's not as complicated a ceremony as typically the empowerments are, but it is a ceremony in that you just basically, I mean, it's been a while since I've done it. You basically make the promise 3 times. You're on one, you are kneeling on one knee and you hold your hands and you promise to uphold the 5 precepts. Uh, 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 Actually, you make the promise. I did when I did it silently, so you can make whatever promise you want to make. But that's how it's done. It's done in a ceremony. You have the Lama there, and he gives you the precepts, and he asks you to take it, and you recite them 3 times, and that's it, as I recall. Does anybody else have a better memory of how it
I'd
goes?
like to ask Kunga something, have him comment on this because he has quite a Dharma center that's based on this whole process. Kunga?
Yeah. So at the Grand Rapids Buddhist Temple, it was founded as a Korean Zen uh, tradition in the beginning, and we've kind of developed on that. We're not a Korean Zen temple anymore. We've kind of hybrid, non-denominational more. We have a little bit of a variety of traditions, but we do a preceptor class. We do it in the fall. People start that program in September,
So
and then
preceptor, just to find that if it kind of we skimmed over, what's the preceptor then? Who is the preceptor?
so students who are interested in taking the 5 precepts, receiving the 5 precepts at the temple, um, I guess they're just want to deepen their practice, really. So they agree to take the 5 precepts, as Bernie has said, a vow not to kill and not to steal, not to engage in sexual misconduct, not to lie, and not to engage in intoxicants. And the idea is that they spend 4 months meeting every Sunday to discuss the precepts. They keep a journal every day. They turn those in for comments. We have a couple of texts. They read the Dhammapada. They read the Heart of the Buddhist Teachings by Thich Nhat Hanh. And then at the end of that process, after they've done that for 4 months, then we have the ceremony where they receive the precepts in a formal ceremony. I think it's a ceremony that's been kind of adapted from a Zen ceremony, but we've made it into our own based on what we do at the temple. I'm sure it's very different than what they do in Tibetan Buddhism. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. What would you say is the difference between taking refuge and taking the precepts? Is there a difference?
Well, that's interesting because I did take refuge with the Shambhala group, and that's when I got my Dharma name, Kunganima. That was very different. We took refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. We didn't discuss the precepts at all. And we don't have a precept. We don't have a refuge class at the temple. I mean, we say the 3 refuges at the beginning of every service, and we have the students, study that and try and memorize that as part of the precepts class. But we don't, and we, spend a lot of time discussing what that means. But we don't have a separate ceremony for that. Even though myself, I took a refuge class first, and I didn't learn about the precept class till later.
So what do you think of the notion that the Buddha experienced these things on his own? He didn't have any kind of an institution or anything like that. He didn't have any prescribed ways to run any rituals or anything to do these things, but yet he was setting forth a program, if you will, for those who want to come into his teachings to organize their minds and so on. But perhaps along the way, while he was doing this, he himself was taking these vows himself. He realized the value of these things all by himself and said, well, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I do. And he's transmitting this now to us through the sutra and to his five disciples and something, saying, "This is the way I did it." And but there's no ceremony here, So my point is that I think the most important ceremony that you have is the one with yourself. To have to stand in front of the sangha, to stand in front of the congregation or whatever, is very nice. And in some people, it may solidify their commitment. But I think the commitment that you take with yourself is the most important. That's what I think. That's the most important one. So whether it's the precepts or whether it's the refuge or so on, all of that, the most important part of it is the vow that you take with yourself. Alex, do you have any comments on this?
I was just going to add that it seems like the self-indulgence.
Alex, excuse me. Before your voice was so perfectly clear, and now it's gotten muddy again. Is there a reason for that?
I'm just in my room now, so I don't know what.
Well, now it's wavering in and out. It seems like your phone or your microphone on wherever device you're using is getting blocked up. And it's very hard to hear you.
How about now?
That's
Yeah.
better.
Oh, that's better. Okay, that's better echo cancellation. All right. So I was going to say that the verse on self-indulgence, I think this is a reference to like some ascetics or yogis who kind of isolate themselves and do all the asanas, all the purifications, all the like practices to get some kind of extraordinary abilities. I mean, not necessarily cities, but just bodily related. Even maybe some cities, some powerful mind, tricks they can play. So basically saying that there should be a balance in all those things. So if you focus on achieving perfection just for the sake of perfection of yourself, that is not a noble kind of path. That will be in distraction in itself. Although you're not harming anybody, you're getting better. You're on your own self-evolution. You're on you're trying to improve yourself. That's not like really noble path, and that's eventually will not lead to awakening or nirvana on its own. There has to be something more in practice, and what is that? There should be the dharma, and then he specifies what is that correct thing that we have to do. And before I was thinking, it's mostly it's a view, mostly it's a point of view, maybe intention, but here he has more that it's a view, it's intention, it's speech, it's action, livelihood, and effort, mindfulness, and finally concentration. So many things have to be done, quote unquote, correctly if one is to approach awakening. So that's what I'm getting from that.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So then he goes, and I think these passages, these paragraphs, stanzas, whatever, need to be read over and over again, and every single word needs to be really, brought into our investigation and think about what all the possibilities of what this might mean. and looking things up in dictionaries, the accepted implied meanings and so on need to be brought into our mind field so that we can open them up and see what they might mean. But the next thing he brings up is the middle way. He says, do not stray. On the other hand, straying from the middle way, you will not pass beyond suffering. So straying from the middle way. So, this is a fundamental teaching of Buddhism. And what is the middle way? How would you describe it? Zara, do you have something you'd like to say about that?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Wait.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. So it's interesting because the middle way, like you think that it actually means moderation, like literally like some kind of conceptual, like hot, warm, cold. And that's actually, I think that's the pragmatics of that word. And I think the middle way is you have to be able to incorporate the spiritual existence with a conventional existence, come in and out of this, going in between these two sort of bodies. It doesn't mean like drink, 20 ounces of water or something. I think when I think of the middle way, it's being able to go back and forth in between, like, yeah, you're on earth and you have to be inside of it. And I don't think it means medium or moderation, right? Like the literal terms. But I think what you're asking is profound and very difficult for people to digest without a lot of self-reflection and study and experiential practice where you're intentional about coming in and out of this your subtle spiritual self, like going through monastic, like these retreats, right, where you pull out and you deal with your consciousness and then go back into the field. That the causality of being around other people provokes your things you need to work on with
All
your
right. So
consciousness.
in the next paragraph, in the next stanza, he says, do not fall into the two extremes. So
Yes,
if
but
there's
that's
extremes, if there's these extremes, and then he's talking about a middle way between these extremes.
so
So,
what would be the extreme, like monastic and right, like where you're away from all of it.
well, it's something a little bit more. Uh, let Bernie, would you explain the extremes?
Well, the extremes would be some kind of asceticism. On the one hand, some kind of asceticism which damages your body. For instance, not eating enough food or not getting enough sleep so that you can't practice well. And the other extreme would be to indulge your body so that you, instead of practicing, you waste your time on frivolous pursuits. So the whole focus, I think, in terms of what is the middle way is whatever organizes your life so that you can practice the best or practice the most and practice the best. So that's how I understand the middle way. It's like focusing your life on your practice rather than just having something else be the focus, whether it be some kind of asceticism, which really has no benefit to you, or some kind of indulgence, which likewise has some kind of temporary benefit, but no long-term benefit.
Gunga, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I agree. I think when we're talking about the first extreme of indulging the desires, it's trying to avoid um, what we normally think of as why people are on earth, to be powerful, to gain money, to gain wealth, to reproduce, like all of those desires of the ego, not being distracted by those, and then also not being distracted by asceticism, which could also be another ego a trip, just a different type of power over your senses, power over, the five senses. Um, and I think of the precepts as fitting in there as following the precepts is setting up an ethical base that makes it easier to practice as well. So, you don't you try and follow the precepts, observe the precepts. That gives you a strong ethical foundation, and then that also sets a nice path for you to practice. Where if you're violating the precepts, you're going to have to deal with all the causes and conditions from violating the precepts. Where if you're upholding the precepts, and not just holding them as prohibitory, but actually, instead of not stealing, you're practicing generosity, or instead of not killing, you're practicing protection of life, then you're creating these positive karmic seeds that are going to assist you in your practice going forward as well. So I think that's how I sort of see those three things fitting together. The indulging your sensual desires is a distraction. You can't really practice when you're doing that because you don't have any time to practice. But following severe ascetic practices also, it's hard to practice when you're starving. It's hard to practice when your senses are dulled by those practices as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex, would you like to comment?
Well, it was said well by previous practitioners here. I would just add that I think we need to take it with a grain of salt, so that what is easy for one person can be extreme for another, and what is extreme for one person can be, a proper maybe practice for self conduct, or maybe self-discipline. So it's I'm not sure how that how Dharma, what Dharma say about that, but just intuitively, or even for us as we go through our life, these extremes, what is extreme and what is not, will probably change as we, becoming a little bit older, or maybe if we get into some kind of condition or disease. So, I mean, if we're sick, we have to sleep more, right? But if we all fed well, and sun is bright, we rested, we should be getting up and do something.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to comment that I think, there's a body aspect to this. We can look at it in terms of the body, we can look at it in terms of the intellect, and we can look at it in terms of the mind in the extremes. To find the middle way in the body, to find the middle way in the intellect, to find the middle way in the mind. So in the body, we've all said that that we need to take care of our body. We need to exercise. We need to eat properly. If we go and we don't exercise enough, or if we exercise too much, we cause harm to ourselves. We go out of balance. If we don't eat enough, or if we overeat, then, we're creating an extreme, and we suffer from those things. But we need to find that middle way regarding our body and so on. So everybody's got a different balance, to some degree or another. And so you need to find what that middle way is for your body. Then for the intellect, I think that, we talk about it in Trikun Kagyu all the time. We talk about that there's two extremes, there's four extremes. So the two extremes of the intellect, I think, would be the individualism on one side, and on the other side would be the materialism on the other side. And that we can stray to, oh, I'm so great. I have all this knowledge. I'm so self-important. Everything revolves around me. And that's one extreme. The opposite extreme of that is the materialism. Oh, I have all these things. These things validate my living and so on. And because I have all these things, I'm so worthy for all these worldly pleasures and enjoyments that I have and so on. And because I have these things, more things keep coming to me. But there's a middle way between both of those things. There's a common way, a balance between the individual and the materialism, the substantialism, sometimes it's called. And that's kind of like an intellectual observation, an intellectual decision that you make. Where is my balance? How do I find that? Where is that? Then the next one is the other extreme. There was two extremes. The first was the materialism and the individualism. The second extreme is more of a mind thing or a spiritual thing, is nihilism on one side, and on the other side is eternalism. Nihilism says, oh, there's nothing matters. We just had this life. You live this life for however many years you can. You do what you can. You get away with as much as you can. There's no reciprocity. You don't have to pay anybody anything. There's no supreme being or anything like that. The only laws that you need to follow are the ones that's going to keep you out of jail. Or keep somebody's husband from chasing you, or keep somebody's brother from chasing you, or whatever example you want to use like that. It becomes just something that says that, oh, I can do anything I want, and because there's nothing else here to judge me. On the other side of that is eternalism. Eternalism is that you will be forgiven for everything, that there is a justice, but the justice comes for everybody, and that no matter what you do, there is a forgiveness, and you will continue to be able to do things, and the Supreme Being will forgive you, and you can enjoy your life and just pay homage to the Supreme Being, and everything will be okay. There's this eternalism that you will live forever. There is a forever soul. Nothing dies. It continues on in that way. In nihilism, it may say you only have this one and only life. But there's a middle way between that. There's a middle way between, saying, well, there may not be a supreme being, but yet we still have a responsibility to other beings to live a noble life, to lead a life of wholesomeness and so on. And we have to judge what that is, but that's a mind thing. That's something that you experience in your heart as opposed to the brain. Something that you experience in your heart. That eternalism. Is there a soul? Where is the soul? Do you experience that in the brain? Do you experience that in the heart? So I think the middle way was the greatest wisdom. Distilled down to one thing was probably the greatest thing that Buddha Shakyamuni taught was the middle way, because before that was a very selfish enlightenment, where in the Hinayana was very selfish oriented. You're going to be enlightened, and the best way to be enlightened was to be a monastic and so on. But then in the middle way, well, you don't have to be to that extreme. You can be in the middle someplace, and you can be a lay person and practice and be a holy person, be a devout person, be a wholesome person, and so on. So the teaching in the middle way became the essence of what the Mahayana is, the great path, the great vehicle. So that was the middle way teaching. So I think that's what's being implied here, all those things. Any comments? Zara, what do you think? Your microphone's muted.
So we would say that would be the way of the layperson, then, the middle way.
A human being.
A human being, okay. I'm thinking of what Bernie and Kunga just said about like the aesthetic extreme, like where you go like all out and you're rough on your body, and then like you're over consuming your sense organs and all ego needs.
But does not apply to anybody?
Oh, for sure, every 24 hours, yes. unless you're away from it, like in complete retreat, and that still can be other things can manifest. But yeah, no, I agree with everything you said. And I think
But even excuse me, but even the retreat, can't that be an extreme? Isn't there a point where that can become extreme?
yeah, I mean, and I can testify right now because I have the blessing. I'm not married. I don't have kids. I don't have pets. I have to be careful about pulling out like on the weekends. I'm like, you should be going out and being around people a little bit, right? Because I will literally just hide out in what I call weekend retreat every single weekend. But I have to ask myself, why are you doing this? Is this really consciousness work, mind meditation, or are you being selfish? Because I don't want to deal with people, right? To your point, you're correct. It requires constantly uh, being introspective and asking yourself difficult questions and being honest. But yes, I agree fundamentally with what you're asking. With this is the correct way. I think it's incredibly difficult, Lance, to do in the Western culture where, and we've done our movie nights, but basically, when you understand how marketing and advertising has basically taken over people's consciousness, like I think most people are going to find it hard to figure this out right now, the way our culture is, at least in the West, because of all the advertising and marketing. I agree with it.
Okay, very good. So then let's move on to the next stanza, and he's talking about the four truths. So it says, there are the noble four truths, the noble ones. What are these four? So I think everybody knows the four. Does anybody have any doubt as to what the four are? Okay. So I think so all life has suffering. There's a cause of suffering, desire, and so on. The five poisons that we talk about, the 84,000 emotions that arise out of that, and so on. And that there is a cessation, that we can stop doing this. But how do we stop doing this becomes the fourth noble truth, is the Eightfold Path. And that's where in the bottom of that second paragraph on the page there, it says, correct view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration is the Eightfold Path. And that's the method that we use to evaluate, what are we doing, and are we contributing to our indulging, or are we contributing to our cessation and to our renouncing, our getting too obsessive with all these different things and so on. So then he goes on to talk about what is suffering, what is the origin of suffering, what is the cessation of suffering, and what is the path that leads to the cessation. So it's all spelled out here very, very simply. It's following a least a common denominator of what it is. It's not embellishing it anymore, and it's giving us a very direct way, concise way to look at this. Another way of looking at this that has been pointed out is that there is two causes and two results. If you look at the Four Noble Truths in terms of there are two causes and two results. So the first result is suffering. Well, what's the cause of the suffering is the second noble truth, is our attachments, is our aversions, is our jealousies, is our ignorance, our delusion, and everything. That's what creates the suffering. So there's a cause and there's a result. Then what's the next result? The next result is that we renounce our attachment. We renounce this life of suffering. And how do we do that? What's the cause of that cessation, of that renouncing? The cause is the Eightfold Path. That if you're on the Eightfold Path and taking it to heart and practicing it and doing it, then that creates the cessation. That creates the renunciation. So to think of it as two causes and two results, I think is very, very succinct. It's very, very useful to be able to think of it in those terms. What do you think of that, Zara? Your microphone's muted.
Yeah, no, I think I think it's practical. Like I think the way you're interpreting it is very practical, especially for someone who's maybe just getting dibble dabbling into this. I mean, yeah, I agree. Obviously, I agree with everything you're saying. So it's more of an issue of experiential. Conceptually, I agree with everything. I get muddled, Lance, right now because where I am is, and I have enough self-detection. I coming in and out of the experiential stuff, like the way a toddler is, where like like when you're born into your spiritual body, where it's like wonky wonk with all the knowledge and experience. And I'm sure all of you will have wisdom. But yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. I'm just trying to live it right now as like a basically a toddler coming into the subtle body and it's like, oh, what's this? What's this? And it can be, it's a little overwhelming sometimes, but I'm sure all of you all had to go through the same thing and you're on the other side of it. Like you know, so you all can kind of relate and have that compassion for me where I'm at right now. And anyone else on YouTube maybe listening, maybe find themselves in the same spot. Like it's overwhelming once you start realizing and unlayering your existence.
Thank you. Good. Bernie, what do you think of, the use of these kinds of, of word sets, that we use as a means to be able to focus our mind very quickly and succinctly, rather than making things very broad, that there are these kind of like rules, if you want to use that term, or maybe you have a better term, something. What do you think about that? Is that practical?
Can you give me an example of what kind of word set you're talking about? It's a little abstract.
Well, very like the Four Noble Truths, and to say,
Oh, oh,
and say here is a set of Four Noble Truths that everybody can understand and follow.
I think, yeah, well, the reason for them originally was so that they could be memorized. So, yeah, have everybody, I mean, it's a learning, it's for learning. It's not quite a mnemonic, but you want to be able to summarize what the teaching is about in a few words. And the Four Noble Truths brings it home, and it's just putting things briefly and succinctly. And yet, concepts like that are very helpful in learning. Of course, the danger with that kind of thing is you can just be a parrot, you can just memorize it without thinking about what it really means, thinking about the deeper implications about it. But if you just don't just memorize it, but you contemplate about it to think what they actually are and what the significance of them are, then it's quite beneficial.
Thank you. Kunga, would you comment, and particularly on the idea of what Bernie was just saying, do we tend to legitimize the way we first learn something, whether it's very, very strict or it's very, very casual, or anything in between that, but we tend to take that to be the truth. And that for us to move from that truth, the way we first learned something, takes a lot of effort for us to be able to accept another way to think about something.
I was just listening to a Dharma talk, and the teacher used this example that Westerners, learn everything from their kindergarten teachers, and it's all based on sort of the Christian worldview. And the teacher who had been studying with Tibetan Buddhists, he said Tibetans all learned from their kindergarten teacher who was Tibetan. So they learn from that worldview. And so they take all these Tibetan teachings for granted. This is how it works. They don't need to know why it works. They just know this is how it works. This is because that's what they learn when they're in kindergarten. And when we come to Buddhism, we're like, well, how does that work? Because that's not what I learned in school when I was a kid. So I think that it makes a big difference what culture we're brought up in, what we take for granted as being the truth and what's not, and what we feel like we need further explanation on. I think it's interesting to think about the first noble truth of suffering. When he was talking, when he says here, he says, what is suffering? This is 2663. It is the pain that accompanies birth, growing, old age, falling sick, and dying. It also includes the suffering of meeting the unpleasant and parting from the pleasant. Not finding what is being sought is also suffering. In short, for five perpetuating aggregates are suffering. This is what we call suffering. And so, I think about that, and then I think about the fourth noble truth, the cessation of suffering, and I think about, how do we put those two together? Because we're certainly physically, we're all going to get old and get sick and die. That pain, that physical pain, is not going to be cured by following the Eightfold Path. But maybe that psychological pain is what we're talking about. Or maybe even what we're talking about is moving beyond labeling life as birth, old age, sickness, and death. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about no birth and no death. And if life is just a transformation, a process, there's not really any, we arbitrarily decide when things are born and when things die and when things are healthy and when things are sick. But really, it's just a process. And by letting go of the labels, then we let go of some of the suffering. So, thank you.
Thank you. Alex, can you comment? I don't know if you're speaking or not, but your microphone is muted, Alex.
I don't really have much to add.
Okay.
Uh,
Well, I'd like to point out what, follow up on what Kunga was just saying in terms of that was in 26.63, what is suffering? And it mentions these 8 characteristics of suffering, So sentient beings, the definition of sentient beings are those who suffer from birth, old age, sickness, and death. So that includes all the animal realm, all the insect realm, all the human realm, all the different beings that we see and can't see, those that are living in the ground, those are living in trees, those are living in the air, and so on like that, that follow those 4 qualities of suffering. But it's a human being who suffers from the next 4. The next 4 of not getting what you want. Then getting what you want, but then having to protect it. There's suffering there. There's suffering in not getting what you want. You have these desires, etc. But now you have them. Now you got to protect them. Now you got to take care of them and so on. The maintaining that. And then the next one is to the suffering of being with beings that you don't like, being incarcerated, going to a cocktail party by yourself and not knowing anybody there and feeling obligated to have to stay there for the next 2 or 3 hours. And, you just feel miserable, looking at the time all the time, or maybe it's being in school or something. We've all had that experience, of being someplace that you don't like, so that's a suffering, and it's a human suffering. Animals don't suffer from that. But then the last suffering is the suffering of not being with your loved ones, being with the ones that you want to be with. That's suffering of your lovers, of your family, whatever, not being with the ones that you love. So those 4 sufferings of not having what you want, getting what you want, but now having to protect it, being with those that you don't like, and then not being with the ones you love. Those are human sufferings. So when you're thinking about sentient beings and thinking about, well, who does that include? Well, it includes all these beings that suffer from birth, death, old age, sickness, and death. But the human beings have those 4 additional sufferings. So these are the things that I was asking about, are these kind of mnemonics, are these kind of word mnemonics that do help us to immediately process and think about, what these, what this wholesomeness means, what this life means, and so on, that gives value, right away. So I think these things are very important, and memorizing them, I think, are part of this, in Buddhism, that's the knock that a lot of people have about Buddhism, because there's so many lists of all these different aspects that have been categorized, to tell you what life is like, and how you can live a pure, wholesome life, and through all these categories. But there are some that are very, very basic. And I think that we owe it to ourselves to know those things, to learn those things. And once they become, you become the embodiment of those things, that wisdom, you see, that wisdom, then you can have compassion for yourself. And the compassion is the method of exercising, actualizing that wisdom. And then you can do it for other beings. You help other beings. And sometimes by doing it for other beings is the method that we use to be able to do it for ourselves. Because sometimes we can't see ourselves, we see other people. And then by doing for other people, that's how we do help ourselves. And that's really, the basic concept of to help other beings in Buddhism, that if we're selfishly doing these things for ourselves, it's self-indulgence. But if we let go of the self and we do it for other beings, that's how we help ourselves. Does that make sense? Any comments on that?
Well, you just gave some really good examples, and I do agree with the mnemonic device, especially someone who's newly into like the last several years, like memorizing some of like the Four Noble Truths, the four thoughts that turn the mind to the Dharma. Like you're exactly right, because in moments of struggle, I go right back to that and start repeating it like into my consciousness. So it's like like a record that just plays like a mantra, like Om Mani Padme Hum, just default and don't even think about it. Could you give us an example of what you just said, though, about in helping someone else, we help ourselves? What's a practical example of that?
Well, I think it's, you work with kids, and, sometimes kids are behaving in bad ways, negative ways, or maybe even positive ways. But you go to admonish those kids that are doing the bad things, and you go to praise those kids that are doing the good things. And then if you think later on, you might not do it at the moment, but later on you're thinking, oh, wow, I do those same things that I was just admonishing that kid for. Or I do those things that, I was praising that kid for. Wow, I have accomplished a lot. I have made a lot of changes. I do good things, and so on. So by thinking about the conversations that you have, and whether it's with kids, or it's with your family, or whether it's at work, or recreationally, whatever, when you reflect on those things, I mean, that's where you see the habitual tendencies, right? That's one of the things that become revealed to you. What are my habitual tendencies? What am I still doing that's good or bad or indifferent? Am I in the middle way? And these things can be, they're all, conditioned, by certain circumstances. In this circumstance, I behave this way, but in another circumstance, I behave another way. So when you first sit down to meditate, sometimes you go through that rehearsal of, well, what was it that I was thinking about yesterday? What was it that, as soon as I got up this morning, the first thought that came into my mind was something that happened yesterday. Why? And sussing that out.
So, okay, that's helpful. You're correct. Now that I've become more aware, like when get aggravated or I'm like joyful or whatever about someone else's behavior, I reflect. You're correct. I now autopilot go, well, have you engaged in that non-optimal behavior? Do you do it too, or do you engage in that positive? So you are correct. I'm calling it out now more myself in a helpful way, so that if I'm criticizing someone else, now I first ask, do you do that? Right? So you are correct. It is self-diagnosing when you're able to see it in someone else, and then also compassion for yourself and the other person. So you don't judge them. First, you need to work on yourself. You need to heal yourself first.
Well, you might be trying to help them, and that's your job and so on like that. But yes, but it does come back to you, and to be able to heal thyself. Yes, Gunga, you just put up a message. I can't read what it said.
Yeah, I put in we were talking about memorizations, and so this is a memorization that I learned that talks about um the first noble truth of suffering. It says, I am of the nature to grow old. There's no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to have ill health. There's no way to escape having ill health. I am of the nature to die. There's no way to escape death. Everything I love and everything I care about is of the nature to change. There's no way to escape being separated from them. So my actions are my only true belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. My actions are the ground upon which I stand. So that's the five remembrances. So I got a little typo in there on there, but basically that's a good memory device to help you be reminded of, on a regular basis. I think that's from Thich Nhat Hanh.
And I think, that's one of the things, I didn't come into the Dharma till I was, like 50 years old or so. And all the things that, I took for granted, I've had to reevaluate. All the things that I thought who I was and everything, all has had to be reevaluated. And I think that's the process of being a good person. That's the process of being on the dharmic path is doing that, reevaluate, not taking anything for granted, not taking your successes for granted, not taking your admonitions that you give to other people. Maybe you have good intention, but it may come off as harsh to them. It may hurt them because you didn't do it quite right. You weren't gentle enough or something, didn't have enough compassion in there. But being able to open yourself up to that, I think, is very healthy. And I think that's part of being on the Dharma path. Looking at our morals, looking at our values. I tend to remember the negative things more than the good things. I don't know if anybody wants to speak about that, but I have nagging thoughts, about things that happened, 35 years ago, or when I was 5 years old, or whatever, and I remember those things. But I'm sure, and people remind me sometimes of the good things that I did, and I'm sure maybe you go through the same thing too. We tend to remember the bad things more.
It depends upon your personality. It
You
depends
think
upon
that's a
your
personality thing?
It's that some people tend to uh, be pessimistic. Other people tend to be optimistic. So it really does depend on your personality.
Well, I'm an optimist, but that doesn't stop me from thinking about the bad things.
Well, some people tend to be more cautious than others. Let's just put it that way. Some people are risk takers and some people are cautious. And the people who are cautious tend to focus on the possibilities that things will turn out badly and guard against them. And the people who are optimists tend to focus on the positive and the things that could have or likely to go well, and kind of ignore the negative things that could possibly happen. And it works both forwards and backwards, so that somebody who's more cautious is going to remember all the things that went wrong in the past. Somebody who's more optimistic will focus on all their triumphs that happened when they were younger. So but both of them are just different forms of egotism, It's just ways of defending and embellishing the self. But I mean, I'm not criticizing anybody. It's a very common kind of thing. Everybody has that to some extent or another. So,
Well, it's the attachment to those things that makes the difference. If there's a strong attachment, then yes, that becomes a real
well,
problem. But
uh,
if those thoughts still come in, but you're able to let go of those thoughts, well, there it is again, but and then you let it go, is that not a success?
well, the thing is that, yeah, you should I mean, thoughts are going to come up depending on your habitual patterns and karma. Should treat them all as like clouds passing through a clear blue sky. Clouds, you don't get attached to clouds. They come and they go, but they don't change the nature of the sky. So, in the same way, whether you're having self-congratulatory thoughts or you're condemning yourself for some reason or other, it really comes down to the same thing. They're just thoughts that come up. You need to look at them, but not be attached to them.
Okay. Anybody else have a comment? Kunga, you have your microphone on.
Yeah, I was thinking about the beginning when we were talking about the middle way, and I was thinking about, some because of causes and conditions, you might be at a place where it's more difficult to overcome the body's, needs. Like I think about people with addiction and how difficult that is to overcome addiction. And that just makes me think about, the five precepts and how important they can be. And we're all in kind of different points. And it's I think the five precepts were established because it set a foundation for the monks to focus more clearly on their spiritual practice. I think it's as lay people, we tend to want to follow the five precepts in a different way, but a way that's easier in our life with families and things. But in the end, it's going to be a longer process for us because just the fact that I guess it could. I guess if you really think about it, you certainly could turn your layperson life into a real you could say that the more challenge you have as a layperson is going to enable you to develop your spiritual practice quicker because you have more challenges than someone as a monk who's maybe living in a monastery. In a way, I guess it could be a quicker path, but I think for most of us, it's a longer path because we don't have because it is so difficult to generate that much mindfulness every moment of your life when you have a life that is much more diverse than a life in a monastery. Thank you.
Alex, Zara, you have any comment on this?
Pingu, you have such a way of just concisely hitting the nail on the head. And what you said is right, because the thing is, and anyone listening, is each of us have our own individual karma, like seed level karma that we are reborn into. So, like, I don't have an issue with, let's say, drugs or alcohol, but I have massive issues with sugar, right? Like, but I have friends who that would not be their issue, would be cigarettes, right? Like, so everyone has their thing they have to work through. And so I really appreciate that you just said that because I think it's easy to be like, why can't I easily do this? Well, it's because it's part of your karma. Like it's something from the past that you have to up level through and you're avoiding, or it's ripening now because of the conditions are proper for you to deal with it. You can deal with it or not. But I appreciate that you just said that because I think that's important because there's the individual karma and then collective karma. So thank you for even reminding me because I find I'm like, how's that so easy for some person, but it feels like a suffer fest for me. But you're right. So thank you for that. That's all I wanted to say. 'Cause and also it's all of you say really good things, and I'm listening with appreciation. So thank you.
And
Oh,
you're saying good
could
things
I build
too.
on that a little bit? Could I build on that a little bit, comment on that a little bit? So
Yeah.
she mentioned, Zara mentioned collective karma and individual karma, and it made me think about, here in our Western world, you know, we're educated, we have access to the Dharma that they didn't have, 50 years ago. We don't have to spend our life, out there hunting and gathering. We don't have to spend our life cleaning. We have protection. We have all these perks that would make it easier to practice. But on top of that, we have all these distractions. We have this capitalism that we needed to deal with. We have racism we need to deal with. We have greed. It seems like some of the barriers are seem to be much stronger, in our society than they were in the Buddha's time period. And it's like a direct result of, the ease of our life, sort of we have this so much entertainment, so much distraction. It's like for some people, I would say that's all there is, that's the life is just about distraction. There's no other meaning to life besides distraction. So that's a huge obstacle for practice. Thank you.
Yeah, that goes to the point of this degenerate age. We've all heard that one time or another many times, I'm sure. That 2,600 years ago, things were much different in terms of who the heroes were. The heroes were holy people, and they had great veneration for the monastics or the ascetics that were roaming the streets, collecting alms and so on, just to get by. People were much more sympathetic to that and would give them willingly and would sit down and have conversation with them. I mean, that's what's been related to us. That was the lifestyle and so on. But now you walk down the street and begging like that, and you're going to get locked up. Things have degenerated to such a point that, spirituality has become an outlaw thing. Oh, that guy's crazy. Did you hear what he said? He ought to be locked up. He's influencing these people and so on. He shouldn't be talking to children and everything. So things are really upside down. One of the things that I first learned when I started, getting into occult science and things like that, process and looking at it in the Western tradition and so on. And it said that in the beginning, was the spirituality, and that the spirituality has slowly been breaking down, and it's gotten to the nadir. Here was the zenith of all spirituality. It's broken down to the nadir of where spirituality has suddenly become, the forgotten, and my mind, went to, oh yeah, we just had World War II, we're just going through Vietnam, all these terrible things are happening and so on. Yeah, this must be the nadir, and then they said, but slowly, things are going to improve, things are going to get better, and we're going to go back to the zenith, to spirituality, because it's a circular process. Things go around in circles and so on. And so, yeah, I tend to think of that. And I think it's an interesting way to look at life. And we talk about going around in circles this way. They were explaining it going around that way, but it's the same point. Look at it as in terms of a sphere. So, in each one of these verses, there is a key word or a key phrase, I think, that encapsulates what that particular stanza is talking about, that particular verse is talking about. The point of not heard previously, the suffering, that the Buddha, he was doing this on his own. The origin, what is the origin of these things? What is the cessation of these things? What is the path that we are on? What is known? What is not known? What is abandoned? What is actualized? what is practiced, what is understood, what is actualized, what is practiced. I think we said that already. So it goes back to something that we've talked about many, many times, and that is the what, the why, and the how. And this particular chapter, this particular section that we're talking about is so fundamental to the Dharma teachings. There's a what in each one of these, there's a why in each one of these, and there's a how in each one of these. And for us to be able to transform, for us to be able to transcend our suffering, our attachment that leads to suffering, our aversions that lead to sufferings, all these things, is a result of knowing the what, the why, and the how. Looking at these things, examining these very things that we have right here. We go to the next page, and the Buddha, the enlightened one, says, oh, I generally contemplated each one of these four truths of the noble ones. I recited them 3 times, but I did not develop the wisdom that sees the 12 aspects. So what are the 12 aspects? And this is something that we have looked at. Anybody want to comment on the 12 aspects?
Bernie?
Okay. Well, the 12
A
aspects.
very repetitive phrasing that I went through. We went through each of the Four Noble Truths 3 times, right? We went through all the Four Noble Truths, and I'd have to say, what was it? I mean,
Is it called dependent origination, in other words?
no, it's he goes through the Four Noble Truths 3 times in these verses that I read. Suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, the path that leads to the cessation of suffering, the Four Noble Truths, and then they're focusing on each of the four, and then he says focusing on knowing each of the four, knowing the suffering, abandoning the origin of suffering, actualizing the cessation of suffering, and practicing the cessation of suffering. So it's what? Knowing, understanding, what? No, God, it's hard to keep all this straight. So knowing, actualizing, practicing, and God, okay, I really don't know, but we go through these things. We've got 12 different verses, and we go through all these the same pattern. Each of the Four Noble Truths 12 times. I mean, the Four Noble Truths 12 times, starting with verses on 1263 up to 1280. 2663 up to 2680. Have to.
Well, from my point of view, I did look at this as the 12 dependent originations, and the way in which, a human being is, the conditions and the situations that a human being goes through, through their life and so on. That's how I did look at it, but Bernie makes a point, so looking at it, from another point of view, there's contemplation, there's recitation, there's development, there's purity, there's developing what is mind, there's a declaration that we make, there's exhaustion of going through and then relaxing and then allowing that relaxed mind then to have the wisdom rise up on its own. When we stop over trying to intellectualize things and we rest, then the inner wisdom comes up, and then we carry it out. We actualize it. We embody it. We begin to do it, and then it becomes accomplished. So that's another way of looking at 12 aspects.
Okay, I just looked it up here online because it's everything's online here. Says there are 3 aspects of each of the 4 noble truths: understanding the truth, knowing what needs to be done to accomplish it, and the realization that it has been accomplished.
All right, will you say that again?
Yeah, I'm just reciting what I said here. No, so first is understanding each of the 4 noble truths. The second is knowing what needs to be done to accomplish it.
1 second. Okay.
Knowing what needs to be done, and the third is actually having done it, or realization of it. So first we understand the truth of suffering. Second, we understand what needs to be done to understand the truth of suffering. And third is fully understanding the truth of suffering through realization of it.
So those are the 12 aspects, the 3 times
Yeah,
4.
it's like 3 different stages.
3 times 4.
3 times 4, 3 stages of it. You start with an intellectual, and then you.
And what was your key word to locate that?
I just asked the question, what are the 12 aspects of the 4 noble truths? And it came up to this page. Maybe there's another page that does it better. But no, first it's so it's the truth, knowing what needs to be done, and the knowledge that it has been accomplished.
You see, and this goes to my point that I was making a half an hour ago or so, 45 minutes ago, do we legitimize our first thought and say, oh, that's the truth? But then through this process, it becomes challenged. Do you hold on to it, or do you yield to be able to accept another way of looking at something that you thought was absolutely true?
Lance, what's a practical example of what you mean? You talking about the Dharma itself? The truth of
Oh,
the Dharma?
anything, but in particular, these 12 things. I leap to the concept. Oh, it's the 12 dependent originations. And I'm holding on to that. But then Bernie comes along and says, "Oh no, there's another way of looking at this," and I missed it. I didn't see that. I didn't read it that way. But yet, it makes more sense in context with what we're studying than the 12 dependent originations, the 12 links. So I have to give that up. How
Yeah.
often do you do that?
Well, and I think that's an issue of self-will, right? Versus you have to defy your own self-will, because that's pride. I mean, like, you look at your faults of the ego. Um, Now I have to do it frequently, but in my 20s and 30s, it was my way or the highway, Lance. Or I have an anger samskara. Like, I get angry too quickly. Some people run off and just hide, so I would go to battle. But no, I now I do it all the time, because that's the pathway of peace, because everybody's point of view typically is from their perspective, correct. You're only experiencing your reality from your central nervous system as best as you can. So you have to be open to other people's perspectives is truly their perspective or interpretation.
Yeah, so I'd like to ask Kunga, he's a moderator, for lack of a better word right now. He's an instructor, who has many people coming to his center that he's part of, every week and everything. And it's very easy to get prideful and locked into your way of thinking and so on. How often does that come to you where, you find that maybe you're challenged and maybe there's a better way. Maybe you weren't thinking right or you didn't hear the question right or something.
I think it comes up a lot, but I just realize it in my own head because I'm not a big speaker. Like people will bring up ideas that I hadn't thought of before, and that'll be news to me. But I'm not spending a lot of time withdrawing my perspective because I tend not to share my perspective a lot. Like I'm not a big talker. But I think that, yeah, realizing that there's other perspectives and my perspective is just the one that I'm attached to or the one that I come up because of my experiences. I know that we read journals all the time, and I'm always thinking about how to comment on this person's ideas who's writing in their spiritual journal in a way that's helpful and encouraging to them, and it opens up doors rather than shuts down, how they're thinking about things. It's important. I mean, I think it's probably the most important practice because it's an emptiness practice, right? Because you're dealing with your own preconceptions and you're working with the idea that, everything is really empty until we start to lay on all our conceptual ideas on top of it. So, anytime that someone challenges your concepts, it's just a reminder that this is another experience of emptiness. That thing which you're attaching a label to doesn't really exist in that way, except in your own mind. It doesn't have a permanent existence. It's more transitory than that. And here, this person here with their different ideas is shining the light on that for you. If you can appreciate that, not get mad about that, or be too attached to your own ideas, you can. I mean, that's the path to enlightenment right there, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Bernie, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I don't know that there's too much to add. Obviously,
Or
we should,
on a personal level, how do you square with that?
well, I'm learning stuff from other people all the time. I just hope to be humble and open enough that I do it more. I think the biggest obstacle the people have to learning new stuff is just their pride. They don't want to admit that they don't know something. And I mean, the best thing to do is just to try to be as humble as possible so that you can learn. I mean, there's maybe you've heard the metaphor of the cup, when you listen to teachers, you shouldn't be like a cup that's turned over so that you can't pour anything into it, or a cup that has a crack so that whatever goes in there leaks out, or there's poison in the bottom of the cup so what gets into the cup can't be drunk. And those symbolize, in the first case, it's pride, so you don't listen to something. The second is not paying attention. So you have that crack in the cup and everything leaks out. And the third is learning the teaching from a bad motivation. So those are the three ways that you shouldn't be listening to a teaching.
There's a Zen story that probably everyone has heard because it's so well documented all over the place about the Buddhist scholar who goes to see the Zen monk for a tea ceremony, and they're going to have the tea ceremony, and after the ceremony, he's going to interview the monk to get some interest, some knowledge. And at the tea ceremony, the monk pours him a cup of tea and just keeps pouring it till it goes all over the table. And the scholar says, "What are you doing?" And the monk says, "Well, you're just like this cup. You're completely filled. There's no room for me to add anything to it. You've got all your opinions and everything. You can't learn anything." I think that's a nice connection with what Bernie was saying.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom in reading books several times and listening to teaching several times. You know, having conversations, practical conversations among the members of the discussion, to clarify things and so on, and to develop a method to be able to question yourself and to be able to accept that, like you all just said, that, well, maybe I need to change my mind. Maybe I need to look at this from a different point of view and so on. As a matter of fact, in many of the teachings, many of the books and the sutras, they say, thus I have heard. And then it goes on to this, what might be pages and pages of a verse, because the author who wrote that, thus I have heard, and what came later, was not present when these things were taught. And they became carried down, by word of mouth, from teacher to disciple, from who became a teacher to disciple, and so on like that. And things like that can get skewed, things like that can get distorted and so on. We try and use the purity as much as possible, but you have to keep, your mind open, your heart open, and recognize that this is all a relative method of communication in the first place. And so to adopt and, to say, well, from this particular point of view, this is the way this particular teacher saw it, or this is the way this particular tradition sees this particular concept or whatever, and not say that this is the absolute. To get caught in that trap, I think, is really what the Buddha was saying. When he first began this, was by saying, the self indulging, that, oh, I know the absolute truth, and that's what this is. So I think, for myself, and that's all I can talk about, really. This whole sutra study is a reckoning. It's a reckoning with 20 years or so of things that I've been absorbing, things that I've been learning, and so on. And I'm filling in a lot of the gaps right now, and maybe having to erase and rewrite some of the points by way of this sutra. Now, I may find other sutras that look at it from a different point of view. And now I'm learning the value of saying, well, from this particular point of view of Lalitavistara, it's expressed this way. But from this other sutra, it may be expressed a slightly different way. Then you have to consider what the differences, what the origins are, and so on like that. Consider the source. Years ago, that was something when I first started getting into philosophic thought and everything, was always to consider the source, where this comes from. And whether it's the internet or it's a book or whatever, we have to consider the source, don't we?
Lance, have you had something profound shift since doing the sutra study over the last several months? Like, have you had something profound, that you'd share with us?
Well, the most profound thing is I don't consider myself to be, a Buddha as much as I'd like to be. but I certainly see the light. I'm on the right path. And that's what I try and share with people. You know, I express things in my own experience. I try to do that as much as I can. And I think that has great value. I think that's a teaching of the Buddha. He didn't explain it from any other point of view than his experience. So that's been validated for me. You know, I felt like that I've been on a path, and I feel validated in that path. You know, and sometimes it's very clear and very bright and right on, and sometimes it's as muddy as it can be.
Amen to that.
So I'm happy with that. I'm satisfied with that. You know, and I've had a fortunate life in that respect, in every respect. You know, the things that I had choice to be able to do, or things that were just very distant the opportunity never clearly came. I'm thankful for, because if any of those things had materialized, I certainly wouldn't be the person I am now, and I'm very happy with that. You know, I might be some successful guy, you know, with, you know, millions of dollars in the bank or whatever, and worrying about it all the time. You know, I don't have that to worry about, and I have to be thankful for it. It's good to be a common man.
In another lifetime, you were a famous musician, Lance, and you learned that lesson. So now
Well,
work past that.
maybe if I'm careful, I'll be that in the next life. But if I'm not careful, it's a trap. You know, it's an ego trap. So, my goodness, it's almost time. Any last thoughts? Anybody like to share?
Um, I'm thinking like why there is such a lot of repetition in in like in the verses. And the way I answer to myself is probably it's kind of like stages of practice, and maybe emphasizing that practice has many stages, and you have to do things like over and over, but maybe at a different level each time, and like deepening understanding and deepening the experience until step by step you get to the final goal, and that's kind of a normal way that everybody can get to the awakening.
Yeah.
But I would be happy to hear if anybody else have any comments on why is it there is like a lot of repetition with only very little change between the
Well, I think you have to look at what that changes. Sometimes it's another word or phrase that further expands what that repetitive idea is. It says it one way, and then it goes around again, and now it says it in a slightly different way. And it goes around again, maybe, and now another phrase is injected into the thought form. So it's not just, the same sentence over and over again. It's a different, form of the sentence.
Well, Lance, and to kind of, Alex, that's a fair point you're asking, and I'll just be brief. One of the things I've noticed in like having to do this deeper consciousness work and the retreat program I'm doing right now is the repetition is repatterning old grooves, right? So like any level of repetition is helping your brain default and go on autopilot to the Dharma, like whether it's the mantra, the Four Noble Truths, or just the repetition of some of these key points that, like you say, they seem almost annoyingly redundant at times, or like there's one word different, but it's meant to actually, I think, be repetitive by design to get into your consciousness, to be that's at least what I've come to terms with some of the redundancy in other parts of some of the training I'm doing, where, and actually it works. Today I was dealing with something and all of a sudden I realized I was saying Om Mani Padme Hung in my head versus reliving an aggravated conversation. That would not have happened 5 years ago. It took years of practice. But I think to your question, that's at least why I practically have come to terms with some of the redundancy.
I think here in 26.79 and 26.80, was this point of I recited the Four Noble Truths and I didn't really get it. But then I recited it 3 more times and then I started getting it. Then I got it. The outer meaning, the inner meaning, and the secret meaning.
Well, Lance, you always tell us like glimpse after glimpse. I'm on my third slow read. 2 or 3 years ago, like now I'm like, it's a whole nother, every time I open, I'm like, ah, got it. And you're right, like you can't rush through something. You have to go slowly, carefully, and methodically. If you're rushing, it's no use. Don't do it. Just go take a nap.
We're basically living it, aren't we?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Those are great points. Some of them I didn't even thought of.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Those are some great points. Also, like to include in consideration. I didn't think of all of them.
Okay. All right, well, we'll close with the short Dekorma prayer on page 35. By the virtues collected in the 3 times, by myself and all beings in samsara and nirvana, and by the innate word of virtue, may I and all sentient beings quickly attain unsurpassed, perfect, complete, precious enlightenment. May the teachings of the great Sri Kumbha Ratna Shri, who is omniscient, Lord of the Dharma, Master of interdependence, continue and increase through study, practice, contemplation, and meditation until the end of samsara. So here it says the great Sri Kumbha Ratna Shri, who is Lord Jigdan Sumgun, who is the founder of the Drikonkagyu lineage. But there's so many other masters at the same level who are emanations in many of different ways, same ways, of Shakyamuni Buddha. So we were thankful for all those great teachers and all their great disciples who are taking this in and transforming themselves. Om, Ah, Hung. Om, Ah, Hung. Om, Ah, Hung. May my body, speech, and mind become inseparable with the body, speech, and mind of all the great masters for the benefit of all sentient beings. Thank you, brothers and sister. Okay,
Have a good night.
you too. We'll continue next week.